Most men in that headquarters had already made up their minds before General George S. Patton ever reached the building. The laughter started quietly at first. A few smiles, a few sarcastic remarks. Then one officer leaned back in his chair and laughed out loud.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
To him, Patton was nothing more than a loudmouth with shiny helmets, ivory-handled pistols, and a talent for attracting newspaper photographers. The room relaxed. Maps covered the walls. Cigarette smoke drifted toward the ceiling. Coffee had gone cold hours earlier. Outside, engines rumbled across the muddy roads of France. Inside, nobody expected that the next half-minute would completely change the mood. The man who had laughed believed he understood George Patton. 30 seconds later, he realized he had judged the wrong man. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back several months. Across both Allied and German headquarters, George Smith Patton, Jr. had become one of the most talked-about generals in Europe. Even before the Normandy campaign reached its most difficult days, stories about him traveled faster than military dispatches. Soldiers spoke about his polished steel helmet with its bright stars. Reporters wrote about his colorful language. Photographs showed him standing beside tanks with his famous ivory-handled revolvers hanging from his belt. To many people who had never served under him, Patton looked more like an actor than a battlefield commander. The Germans noticed the same image. Their intelligence officers collected newspaper articles, intercepted radio broadcasts, and studied Allied commanders. Patton's public reputation fascinated them. He was loud. He appeared fearless. Sometimes he seemed almost impossible to control. Several German staff officers believed his personality would eventually become his weakness. They assumed disciplined planning would defeat dramatic leadership. It was an understandable mistake, but it was still a mistake. Not everyone inside the Allied command admired him either. General Dwight D. Eisenhower respected Patton's ability, but often worried about his temper. General Omar Bradley appreciated Patton's speed in combat, but sometimes questioned his judgment. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a complicated relationship with him, built on rivalry as much as cooperation. Among senior officers, opinions about Patton rarely stayed neutral. People either admired him or doubted him. Very few stood in the middle. The doubts became even louder after the Sicily campaign in 1943. News spread through Allied headquarters that Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue. Today, many would recognize those men as suffering from severe combat stress. At the time, the incident shocked military leaders. Eisenhower privately condemned Patton's actions and forced him to apologize. For months afterward, Patton disappeared from major combat command. Newspapers stopped writing about victories and focused instead on controversy. To many observers, his career looked finished. That belief became one of the greatest misunderstandings of the Second World War. While critics believed Patton had been pushed aside, German intelligence reached a very different conclusion. Adolf Hitler himself considered Patton the Allies' most aggressive battlefield commander. German analysts watched him closely, convinced that wherever Patton appeared, a major attack would soon follow. Ironically, while some Allied officers dismissed him as an embarrassment, German commanders feared him enough to build plans around his movements. Early in 1944, that strange contrast became even stronger. The Allies were secretly preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Every important commander had a role to play, but Patton's assignment surprised almost everyone. Instead of leading the invasion force, he was placed in command of the 1st United States Army Group, better known as FUSAG. On paper, it looked like a massive army preparing to invade France through the Pas-de-Calais. In reality, much of the army did not exist. Rubber tanks stood in empty fields. Wooden aircraft lined fake airfields. Radio operators transmitted endless streams of false messages. Trucks drove in circles to create dust clouds visible from enemy aircraft. The entire operation became part of an enormous deception known as Operation Fortitude. Patton himself was one of the biggest pieces of that deception. German intelligence believed the Allies would place their strongest commander at the main invasion point. Since they believed Patton was that commander, they assumed the real attack would come at Calais instead of Normandy. Even after Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, many German commanders continued waiting for Patton's real invasion farther north. Without firing a shot, Patton helped keep valuable German divisions away from Normandy during the most critical days of the campaign. Yet inside some Allied headquarters, old opinions refused to disappear. He loves attention. He thinks war is a parade. He'll create another scandal. Comments like these continued circulating through staff meetings and planning conferences. Many officers judged Patton by newspaper headlines rather than battlefield results. They saw the polished helmet before they saw the disciplined commander underneath. What they rarely understood was how carefully Patton studied war. Long before the conflict began, he had spent years reading military history. He analyzed campaigns led by Napoleon, Julius Caesar, and Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He believed speed created confusion, confusion created fear, and fear destroyed armies faster than bullets alone. Every order he issued reflected that philosophy. His staff quickly learned one important lesson. Patton expected movement. A division that stopped too long invited criticism. Supply officers had to think faster. Engineers had to repair roads immediately. Tank crews worked through the night. Mechanics rarely slept during major operations because Patton refused to let broken equipment slow an advance. His headquarters operated at a pace that exhausted everyone around him. That relentless speed produced results. After finally receiving command of the U.S. Third Army on August 1, 1944, Patton launched one of the fastest advances in American military history. Following the breakout from Normandy near Avranches, his armored columns raced across France with astonishing momentum. Town after town fell before German commanders could establish new defensive lines. Fuel became a greater problem than enemy resistance. Some tank units advanced so rapidly they nearly outran their own supply trucks. German reports became increasingly desperate. Instead of describing slow, predictable attacks, they reported American columns appearing where no one expected them. Road junctions disappeared almost overnight. Bridges thought secure suddenly filled with Sherman tanks. Communications broke down under constant pressure. Patton was not simply attacking enemy positions, he was attacking their ability to think clearly. Still, reputation has enormous power. Success on the battlefield did not immediately erase months of criticism inside Allied headquarters. Some officers continued viewing Patton as an impulsive commander who relied more on confidence than planning. They noticed his speeches but ignored the hours he spent studying maps. They remembered his dramatic public image but overlooked the detailed logistics behind every offensive. That mindset followed several officers into an important planning conference held in France during the late summer of 1944. The room filled early. Senior staff members gathered around large operational maps covered with colored pins showing Allied and German positions. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft lay stacked across long wooden tables. Telephone operators waited beside field switchboards. Outside, military police controlled every entrance. Inside, conversation drifted toward one familiar subject. Patton, one officer, joked that everyone would know exactly when Patton arrived because they would probably hear him before they saw him. Another smiled. A third laughed. The laughter spread across the room. To them, George Patton remained the same loud general from newspaper photographs. A man who loved dramatic entrances. A commander who cared more about appearances than careful planning. They expected another performance. None of them realized that Patton had already spent hours studying the latest intelligence reports before driving to headquarters. None of them knew he had identified a critical weakness in the German front that could change the coming operation. And none of them understood that within the next 30 seconds, one calm entrance, one sharp observation, and one perfectly timed statement would erase the laughter completely. The room fell quiet before anyone realized it had happened. The laughter had not ended because someone ordered silence. It ended because General George S. Patton walked through the doorway with a stack of folded maps under one arm and several handwritten notes in the other. He did not rush. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply looked around the room once, making brief eye contact with the officers gathered near the main operations table. Then he walked directly to the largest map without greeting anyone. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The officers who had been smiling only moments earlier waited for the dramatic entrance they expected. It never came. Patton placed his maps on the table, picked up a grease pencil, and immediately circled 3 road junctions east of the Moselle River. Without raising his voice, he began pointing out recent German troop movements reported by aerial reconnaissance during the previous 24 hours. He explained that the enemy was shifting armored reserves in response to Allied pressure farther north. Most officers had seen the same reports. Very few had connected them together. Patton had. The room changed almost instantly. The officer who had laughed leaned forward. Another stopped writing and stared at the map. A British liaison officer quietly unfolded his own intelligence summary to compare it with Patton's observations. Every statement matched the latest reports. More importantly, Patton was already describing what the Germans would probably do next. That was the difference. Many commanders explained what had happened yesterday. Patton focused on tomorrow. He believed enemy armies behaved like living organisms. Push them hard enough in one place, and they would weaken somewhere else. Force them to react repeatedly, and eventually, they would lose the initiative. That philosophy shaped every campaign he commanded. It was never enough to win today's battle. He wanted the next battle already decided before the first one ended. As the discussion continued, Patton calmly described how German commanders would likely attempt to slow the Allied advance by sacrificing smaller units to protect key transportation routes. If the Third Army moved quickly enough, those routes could be captured before organized defenses formed. Delay even 2 days, he warned, and the Germans would rebuild an entirely new defensive line. Several officers questioned whether the advance could be supplied. It was a reasonable concern. Fuel shortages were becoming serious across France. Ammunition trucks already struggled to keep pace with advancing armored divisions. Every additional mile placed greater pressure on supply columns stretching back toward the Normandy beaches. Patton acknowledged every logistical problem. Then, he answered each one. He explained which roads engineers had already repaired. He identified bridges capable of carrying heavy tanks. He listed fuel priorities by corps instead of division, allowing the fastest spearheads to continue moving while slower formations reorganized behind them. His understanding extended far beyond battlefield tactics. He knew the names of rivers, bridge capacities, rail junctions, fuel consumption rates, and estimated repair times for damaged highways. The room listened. The man who had laughed 30 seconds before now said nothing at all. That moment became memorable not because Patton embarrassed anyone, but because he destroyed an illusion. The polished helmet, the revolvers, the bold speeches, and the newspaper headlines had convinced many people that appearance defined the man. In reality, those visible symbols distracted attention from the disciplined professional underneath. Patton had spent decades preparing for moments exactly like this. Even before the First World War, he studied cavalry tactics and modern weapons. During the interwar years, he became one of the strongest advocates for armored warfare inside the U.S. Army. He followed developments in Europe closely, understanding that future wars would depend on speed, coordination, and aggressive maneuver rather than slow trench fighting. His notebooks filled with observations from military history. His library contained works by commanders from ancient Rome to the 19th century. Behind every confident decision stood years of preparation. That preparation became obvious again during one of the most famous operations of the war. In December 1944, German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, beginning what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. While snow covered roads across Belgium and Luxembourg, American units struggled to stop the sudden attack. The town of Bastogne quickly became the center of the fighting as the 101st Airborne Division found itself surrounded. Senior Allied commanders gathered to decide their response. Many expected it would take days simply to reorganize. Patton had already anticipated the possibility. Days before the German offensive reached its full strength, he had quietly instructed his staff to prepare alternative operational plans. During the conference at Verdun on December 19, 1944, Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower asked how quickly the Third Army could pivot north and relieve Bastogne. Patton answered without hesitation. 48 hours. Several officers reportedly found the estimate difficult to believe. Redirecting an entire field army during winter conditions seemed almost impossible. Yet because Patton had ordered contingency planning before the conference even began, his headquarters already possessed the necessary marching orders. The movement started almost immediately. Thousands of vehicles changed direction. Engineers cleared icy roads. Military police redirected endless traffic. Fuel depots shifted priorities overnight. Infantry, artillery, tanks, medical units, and supply columns all turned north in one of the largest operational pivots executed by the U.S. Army during the war. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne, breaking through to the surrounded defenders. To outside observers, it appeared almost miraculous. To Patton, it was preparation meeting opportunity. Stories like these gradually changed opinions across Allied headquarters. Officers who had once dismissed him as reckless began recognizing patterns behind his decisions. He accepted calculated risks, but those risks usually rested upon detailed planning. He demanded speed because he understood that hesitation often cost more lives than bold action. Every hour gained prevented the enemy from strengthening defenses. German commanders learned the same lesson. General Hasso von Manteuffel later acknowledged the speed with which American forces under Patton reacted during critical moments. Other German officers repeatedly described the Third Army as relentless. They understood that once Patton found a weak point, he rarely paused long enough for them to recover. His greatest weapon was not simply tanks or artillery. It was tempo. Tempo exhausted opponents. A commander forced to react all day eventually made mistakes. Patton counted on those mistakes. Even his famous public image served a purpose. The polished helmet, the pearl-handled revolvers, and the confident speeches created a larger-than-life reputation. Newspapers loved it. Soldiers remembered it. German intelligence watched it carefully. While critics sometimes dismissed it as vanity, that same reputation also influenced enemy expectations. During Operation Fortitude, German leaders remained convinced Patton would command the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais, largely because they believed such an important attack demanded the Allies' most aggressive commander. Sometimes reputation itself became a weapon. That is why the story of the laughing officer has endured for so many years. Whether every detail has been repeated exactly as it happened is less important than the truth it represents. Throughout the war, many people underestimated George S. Patton before meeting him, working with him, or fighting against him. Some saw only confidence. Others saw only controversy. They failed to notice the discipline hidden beneath the personality. History eventually reached a different conclusion. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Third Army had advanced hundreds of miles across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. It had liberated countless towns, captured hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, and played a major role in breaking the military power of the Third Reich. Those achievements were not created by luck. They came from relentless planning, constant movement, and a commander who believed hesitation was often the enemy's greatest ally. George S. Patton remained a controversial figure until the end of his life. His temper created problems. His words sometimes caused unnecessary political storms. His personality could divide even his closest colleagues. None of those facts should be ignored. But neither should the qualities that made him one of the most effective field commanders of the Second World War. The officer who laughed believed he was about to watch another performance. Instead, he witnessed something far more impressive. He saw a commander whose confidence was supported by preparation, whose boldness rested on knowledge, and whose reputation concealed a brilliant military mind. In less than 30 seconds, laughter gave way to respect. And in war, respect was often earned not by the loudest voice in the room, but by the man who understood the battlefield better than everyone else. That was George S. Patton's greatest victory long before the shooting stopped.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.